galaxy was dying, and I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. It was a slow death, one that had started millennia ago, but now it was accelerating. Stars that had once burned brightly in the heavens were flickering out like dying candles, their light dimming until they vanished into the dark abyss. Planets that had supported life, teeming with civilizations and wonders, were now barren rocks or ash. The great empires of the universe, once filled with pride and hubris, had crumbled into nothing, their legacies erased by time and entropy. All that was left were whispers, echoes of a past that could never be reclaimed. I stood at the bridge of the Endeavor, staring at the vastness outside the viewport. The black void stretched out infinitely, dotted only by the faint glow of distant stars and the occasional wreckage of a fallen ship. There was nothing left to conquer, no grand missions left to complete. The universe had turned in on itself, collapsing under the weight of its own failure. And yet, here we were, survivors, a handful of humans still clinging to life, adrift in a sea of dying stars. Our ship was a relic, a remnant of a once proud fleet. The Endeavor had seen better days. Its hull was scarred from countless battles, its engines barely functioning, but it was ours. It was all we had. The ship was a sanctuary now, a place where the last of humanity could hold on, fighting against the inevitable. We were a fleet of 1,000, scattered across the galaxy, but it felt like we were the last species left, the last to care. The message had come to us from the farthest reaches of space, a whisper that we had almost missed. It had taken years for it to reach us, and by the time we decoded it, the galaxy had already begun to die. The alien race that had sent it was long gone, their star systems gone cold, their people wiped from existence. But the message they left behind was clear. A warning, perhaps, or a directive. A final piece of wisdom from a dying civilization. Never stop protecting the weak. It was simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. For a moment, I wondered if it was a mistake, a relic of an earlier time, meant for someone else, some other people. But as I sat in the quiet darkness of the bridge, I knew it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just a message. It was a command. For all our failures, for all the mistakes humanity had made, this was a truth we could still hold on to. As civilizations fell and stars flickered out, the one thing that had never changed was the belief that the strong should protect the weak. And perhaps that was all we had left. Perhaps that was the one thing that could save us. I glanced around at the faces of the crew, their expressions etched with exhaustion, with loss. We were no longer soldiers or explorers. We were caretakers now. We were the protectors of the few who remained, those who had no place to go and no one else to rely on. It wasn't a grand mission, nor was it glorious, but it was necessary, and it was the only thing we could do. The galaxy was dying, but we would not as long as we had each other, not as long as we remembered the message. And so we continued, drifting through the void, waiting for a reason to hope, waiting for a sign that maybe, just maybe, we weren't the last ones left after all. We were the last. It wasn't a phrase that carried weight anymore. It was simply a reality we had learned to accept. The idea of the last of humanity had once been a great tragedy, a devastating loss. Now it was a quiet, somber fact of life. There were no more bustling cities, no more thriving nations, no more centuries-old traditions to celebrate. The great civilizations of Earth, of Mars, of the moons of Jupiter were all but memories now. The once huge space colonies had become isolated havens, some broken down into rubble, others forgotten in the vastness of space. Yet somehow, against the odds, we persisted. I looked out the viewport at the stars beyond, feeling the weight of history pressing down on me. The Endeavor wasn't much to look at. It was a patchwork of salvaged ships, old technology, and makeshift repairs. When the last of the great fleets fell, The few survivors who could escape to space had found one another. Some of us had come from Earth, some from Mars, others from distant colonies, but we were all united by one thing now: the will to survive. It was no longer about empire building or exploration, it was about survival. Our mission, if you could call it that, was to find a place for the rest of us to live, what was left of humanity. We weren't fighters, not like the warriors who had fought in the great wars of old. No, we were survivors, scavengers, people who knew how to make do with what little we had left. The ship was a testament to our adaptability. The hull was dotted with patches and repairs that told the story of our journey, a battle here, a close call there. Each dent and crack marked a chapter of survival. The Endeavour wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol of who we had become: resilient, resourceful, and perhaps a little broken. But we were still here, and we were still fighting. The survivors, the last remnants of humanity, were scattered across the galaxy. We didn't live in cities anymore. We lived in ships, on moons, on planets that had been abandoned by their previous inhabitants. The Endeavour was just one of many ships now. A ragtag fleet of survivors had formed around us, and though we were not large in number, we were united by one thing: the belief that we could still make a difference. We were no longer an empire. We were a community. Each day, we did what we could to keep things going, repairing systems, scavenging for resources, and, most importantly, looking for others. There was a deep sense of longing among us, a desire to connect with the rest of humanity, to find others who were still out there. But the galaxy was vast, and we were small. Our chances of finding anyone were slim, but we kept searching anyway. After all, what else was there to do? The message had come through at the right time, though. It had been years since we'd heard anything from anyone outside our fleet. The transmission had been faint, almost lost in the static of the dying galaxy, but it carried a weight. The message had come from a forgotten race, a civilization long gone. They had known the galaxy was dying. They had seen the stars flicker out, their people falling, one by one, into extinction. But in their final moments, they had left us something: a lesson, a command. Never stop protecting the weak. It wasn't just a directive, it was a reminder of who we were, what we had always been. Even in the face of certain death, even as the galaxy collapsed around us, we could still hold on to that one principle. It was our purpose now, to protect the weak, to help those who could not help themselves. The survivors on the Endeavour knew the cost. We knew that protecting the weak meant risking everything. But that was the price of survival, the cost of what it meant to be human. And so we continued. Every day we took another step forward, never stopping, never faltering, always pushing toward the unknown. The first sign of the Gorvith came in the form of a distant transmission, a distorted message cutting through the empty void. At first it was nothing more than static, a jumble of numbers and odd frequencies that we couldn't make sense of. But as the signal grew clearer, we realized that we were not alone in the darkness. The Gorvith were coming. They had always been a threat, a brutish race of conquerors, but we hadn't expected them to reach us so soon. The galaxy was dying, yet they still thrived on conquest, their insatiable hunger for power pushing them to seek out whatever scraps of life remained. I stood in the command center of the Endeavour, watching as the crew worked in a frenzy, analyzing the incoming transmission. The message was clear: surrender or face annihilation. The Gorvith had detected our fleet, and they were determined to take what little we had left. It wasn't just us they were after. It was anyone. They were predators, and we were their prey. The Endeavour was not built for war. We were a ship designed for survival, a patchwork vessel meant to transport us from one dead star system to the next. It had been years since we had seen anything resembling a real enemy, and the crew had become complacent. We were survivors, not soldiers. But now there was no time to prepare. The Gurvith were already closing in. I turned to face the crew. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear, but they were ready. They had no choice. I had no choice. "We can't run," I said, my voice steady, though inside I was trembling. "We stand and fight. For the weak, for the people we're protecting." The words came out more forcefully than I had intended, but they were true. We had no time for fear, no room for doubt. This was our chance to prove that the last message of the dead galaxy wasn't just some dying whisper. It was a call to action. We weren't going to let the Gurvith take what little we had left. We would fight, no matter the cost. The alarms blared across the ship as the Gurvith fleet appeared on the sensors. Their ships were massive, their weapons powerful, and their numbers overwhelming. They didn't even bother with diplomacy. The Gurvith had no interest in negotiation. They only understood domination. We were outmatched in every way. But we had one thing they didn't. The crew scrambled to their stations, and I took my seat at the command console, my hands trembling as I activated the weapon systems. "All hands, brace for impact," I ordered, my voice steady despite the chaos around me. We were small, our firepower insignificant compared to the Gurvith's arsenal, but we would not go down without a fight. We couldn't. The people who had placed their trust in us, the ones who had nowhere else to go, depended on us. The first blast from the Gurvith struck the hull of the Endeavour, and I felt the ship shudder under the impact. The lights flickered, and the alarms wailed as the hull groaned under the strain. "Damage report," I shouted, my voice rising above the noise. Shields are holding, but they're weakening," one of the engineers called out, her voice tinged with panic. "We can't take much more of this." "Keep them up," I ordered, gripping the edge of the console. The ship lurched again, another blast hitting the side. We had minutes at best before the Gurvith would breach the hull, and there was no way we could win this fight. But we weren't going to run. We weren't going to let them take what we had left. I turned to the crew, meeting each of their eyes. "We fight for them," I said, the words echoing through the room. "We fight for everyone who's counting on us. No one is left behind." And so we fought. The Endeavour fired its weapons, its systems straining against the force of the enemy's barrage. The ship shuddered with each impact, but we held firm, determined to buy time for the weak, for those who had nowhere to hide. The battle was chaos, a swirling mess of explosions and energy beams, the very fabric of space itself trembling with the force of it all. The Gurvith ships were overwhelming, but we held them off, inch by inch, with every ounce of our strength. And through it all, the one thought that kept us going was that we would never stop protecting the weak. Not now, not ever. The battle raged on, each moment stretching into eternity as the Endeavour fought to hold its ground. The Gurvith fleet advanced relentlessly, their massive ships firing upon us with terrifying precision. The ship groaned with each strike, its hull buckling under the weight of the assault. The crew worked in a frantic blur, moving from station to station, trying to keep the systems online, trying to maintain some semblance of control in the face of an enemy that seemed unstoppable. I could hear the echoes of alarms blaring throughout the ship, the panic in the voices of my crew as they scrambled to keep the ship intact. The energy shields flickered, faltered, and then failed entirely as another blast from the Gurvith fleet tore through the outer layers of the hull. I could feel the vibrations through the floor beneath me as the ship shuddered under the impact. The lights flickered and then dimmed as power systems began to fail. But we were still alive. The Endeavour was still holding on. It was all we had left. I stood at the helm, my knuckles white from gripping the console. The steady hum of the engines was a reminder that we hadn't lost yet, that we were still in this fight. But it was a fleeting hope. We had no more tricks up our sleeves, no more strategies to buy us time. The Gurvith were overwhelming, and we were outmatched in every sense. The last of our fighters had launched, and we were now relying solely on the ship's aging systems to defend us. "Damage report," I barked, my voice rising over the din. "The hull's breached on decks 4 through 7, the chief engineer replied, her voice tense but steady. "We've lost oxygen on deck 5. The forward shields are down to 12%, and the engines are failing. I don't know how much longer we can keep her running, Captain." My heart sank. We were dying slowly but surely. The Endeavour was taking on water, figuratively speaking, and we were running out of time. The Gurvith would not stop. They would press the attack until we were nothing but space debris, and there was nothing we could do to prevent it. And yet, as I stood there, looking out at the advancing enemy ships, I felt something stirring inside me. It wasn't fear, it wasn't panic, it was something else, a quiet, unshakable determination. We weren't going to let them win. We weren't going to let this be the end, not while there were still people on this ship who depended on us. "We can't let them board," I muttered to myself, more to steady my thoughts than anything else. If the Gurvith breached the ship, if they managed to get inside, it was over. We wouldn't have time to evacuate, wouldn't have time to get the rest of the survivors to safety. "We fight," I said, my voice louder this time. "We fight until the very last." The crew heard me. The engineers, the medics, the technicians, all of them. They were tired, they were scared, but they were also determined. They had seen what I had seen, the truth in the message that had brought us here. Never stop protecting the weak. It wasn't just a phrase. It was the reason we had fought this far. It was the reason we hadn't given up, even when the stars themselves were dying. And now, as the Gurvith came crashing toward us, we would fight for that same reason. The first of the Gurvith ships broke through the remaining shields, sending an explosion rippling through the Endeavour. The lights flickered again, and for a moment I thought we were done for. But then the comms buzzed, and a voice, barely audible over the static, came through. "We've got the escape pods ready, Captain. We can still get the civilians out." It was our only option now. Get the survivors off the ship. The rest of us would stay behind, hold the line, and buy them as much time as we could. It was the only way we could protect the weak, the ones who had nowhere else to go. "Do it," I ordered, my voice steady despite the chaos around me. "Launch the pods." The battle continued to rage. The ship was now a wounded animal, fighting for its life. The Gurvith ships continued to hammer at us, and we did everything we could to repel them. But I knew the truth. We wouldn't make it out of this. The Endeavour would fall. But as long as there was one escape pod left, one person still alive, we had done our duty. And so we fought on. The ship groaned with each new impact, but we kept firing, kept defending, kept protecting the weak. Because no matter the cost, that was what we had to do. That was the message we had been given, the message we would carry to the end. The sound of the Gurvith ships tearing through the Endeavour was deafening. Each impact reverberated through the ship like the crack of thunder, sending jolts of panic through the crew. But they kept moving. We kept moving. The evacuation had begun. The escape pods launched one by one, carrying the survivors to safety as best they could. But I knew the truth. Most of them wouldn't make it. The pods were fragile, and the Gurvith were relentless. We had no illusions that they would simply let our people escape. We had no illusions that we would survive. But we kept fighting. For the weak, for the ones who didn't know how to survive on their own, for the children, for the elderly, for the sick and the broken. They were the reason we hadn't given up, the reason we still fought in the face of impossible odds. We might have been a scattered few, but we had one thing the Gurvith didn't: purpose. I stood at the helm of the ship, my hands gripping the console so tightly my knuckles turned white. The Endeavour shuddered again, another blast striking the aft section. I could hear the fire alarms, the cries of crew members who had already given their lives to keep the ship going, but we were still alive, and we had to keep the ship together for as long as we could. "We can't take much more of this," shouted the chief engineer, her voice cutting through the chaos. I could hear the tremor in her tone, the resignation. We were running out of time, running out of ship, but there was no stopping now. The battle wasn't about victory anymore. It was about survival. It was about ensuring the weak had a chance. Focus on getting the remaining civilians to pods, I ordered, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. We'll hold them off as long as we can. The crew scrambled into action, each of them doing what they could. We weren't soldiers, not anymore, but we were something else. A family, a band of survivors who knew what it meant to care for those who had nothing left. We knew what it meant to protect. As the Gorvith ships closed in on us, I felt the weight of the responsibility on my shoulders more than ever. The Endeavour was no longer just a ship. It was a symbol of everything we had left, the last ember of humanity's fire. But even that ember was fading. The Gorvith would eventually snuff it out, but not yet, not while we had breath in our bodies. The first Gorvith boarding party made its way through the outer hull, cutting through the metal with ease. The crew moved into positioning what little defense we had left. I watched as the first wave of invaders stormed onto the ship, their hulking forms silhouetted in the flashing lights of the breach. But there was no fear in our eyes. There was no retreat in our hearts. We stood firm. The firefight was brutal. The Gorvith were relentless, their weapons designed for sheer destruction. They didn't care about precision, only about crushing everything in their path. But we didn't give up. We fought with everything we had, every last ounce of strength, because we knew what was at stake. For the survivors, for the weak, we would hold the line. I felt a sharp pain in my side as I ducked behind a bulkhead, a blast from the Gorvith's energy weapon grazing my ribs. The force of the impact knocked me to the ground, my vision blurring for a moment. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I forced myself back to my feet, the pain barely registering as I took up a weapon and fired into the advancing Gorvith. They didn't flinch. They didn't care. But we cared. We cared with every fiber of our being. The sound of another explosion rocked the ship, sending me crashing into the wall. My ears rang, but the fire in my chest burned brighter. I couldn't let go, not yet, not while there was still a single person alive on this ship. I heard shouting, the unmistakable crackle of static as a transmission came through. It was the commander of the last escape pod fleet. The civilians were almost clear. Just a little longer, and we could save them all. But as I looked toward the door where the Gorvith were approaching, I knew that little longer might not be enough. The Endeavour was falling apart, piece by piece. It wouldn't hold much longer. But somehow that thought didn't scare me. What scared me more was the thought of not finishing what we'd started. We hadn't come this far to surrender. Not to them. Not to anyone. I looked at the crew, each of them battered but still standing, still fighting. We were losing the battle, but we hadn't lost yet. And as long as I had a breath left in my lungs, I would not stop protecting the weak. We would hold until the very end. The sound of footsteps echoed through the dimly lit corridors of the Endeavour, a hollow, metallic rhythm that seemed to mirror the heavy thud of my own heartbeat. The Gorvith were getting closer. The last of the escape pods had launched, the survivors safely off the ship, or at least as safely as could be expected. But we, the last crew, were still here, still fighting. There were only a few of us left now, just enough to make a stand. I didn't know if it would be enough, but I knew that we would make them pay for every inch of the ship they tried to take. I moved through the hallways, my side aching where I'd been hit earlier. It wasn't much, just a grazing wound, but it was enough to slow me down. The blood from the gash had long since dried, but the sharp burn of pain lingered, a constant reminder that time was running out for all of us. I wiped my brow, trying to ignore the sickening feeling that had settled in my gut. We had lost. I knew it in the pit of my stomach. The Endeavour was doomed, and the Gurvith were on their way to finishing what they'd started. They had overrun the ship's defenses, breached sections we tried to fortify, and now they were systematically making their way through the inner passages. The ship's power was waning, and in the silence between explosions, there was a haunting realization that this was it. Still, there was something else, a flicker of something deep within me, an echo of that first message, that final message from a dead galaxy. Never stop protecting the weak. That was all that mattered now. We had done our duty to the best of our abilities. The escape pods had carried the last of the civilians away, far from the chaos, far from the Gurvith. But we were still here, the last of humanity, fighting for something bigger than ourselves. I reached the last remaining command post, the one place on the ship where we could make a final stand. The crew members who remained, 3, maybe 4 of us, were already here, gearing up for the inevitable. We had no delusions of victory. This wasn't about that. This was about giving the survivors a chance, about ensuring that we held as long as possible, that the message of who we were, who humanity was, wouldn't be forgotten. "Is everyone ready?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though I knew it was futile. There was no calm now. We had no more time to prepare. The engineer who had been with us from the start nodded grimly. "We've set the charges, Captain. If it comes to it, we'll blow the whole section." A medic, his face ashen but steady, stood at the rear. "We'll fight. I've got enough supplies to hold out for a while, but—" He trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. We all knew what that meant. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped my weapon. Then we hold. We fight until we can't anymore. The crew nodded, and for a moment there was a strange peace in the air, a silent understanding that we had done everything we could. The Gurvith were coming, but we were not going to just roll over. We would stand, we would fight, and we would make them remember that humanity was more than just a relic of a lost time. We had done good in the universe, and if we had to die to preserve that legacy, then so be it. The first Gurvith soldier appeared at the end of the hallway, a hulking figure clad in thick metallic armor, its eyes glowing a malevolent red. It raised its weapon, and I fired first. The shot hit it square in the chest, but the Gurvith didn't even flinch. It was like shooting a mountain. "Get down!" I shouted, and we all dove for cover as the Gurvith returned fire, their weapons ripping through the walls with ease. The ship trembled under the onslaught, and I could hear the distant sound of more explosions, more breaches. We weren't alone anymore. The enemy was everywhere. The firefight was chaotic, every shot we fired seeming to do little more than slow them down. But it wasn't about stopping them. It was about stalling. We kept them contained in the narrow hallway, each of us taking turns to fire and reload, moving only when absolutely necessary. The ship was our fortress, and we would not let it fall without making them earn every inch. Minutes stretched into hours, and the Gurvith kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. We were exhausted, but we didn't give up. We couldn't. Not while there was still one last person left alive on this ship. The last message had been clear: protect the weak. And that's what we did, holding the line with every last breath, with every ounce of energy we could muster. It wasn't the fight we had hoped for, but it was the fight we were given. We were the last of humanity, and we would never stop fighting. The end came quietly, without fanfare. It wasn't the roaring victory or the loud, defiant last stand I had imagined. It was the slow, inevitable collapse of everything we had worked so hard to protect. The Gurvith were methodical in their assault, overwhelming us at every turn, picking us off one by one. Their relentless march down the corridors of the Endeavour like a tide sweeping over a broken dam. The ship was no longer a vessel, it was a tomb, a vessel of lost hope and broken dreams. I hadn't expected to survive, no one had, but there was still a fire in me, a refusal to give in until the very last breath. The charge had been set, the detonators primed, and as I looked around at the few of us still standing, each of us bloodied, exhausted, with the weight of our failure heavy in our eyes, I knew that our time had come. The Gorvith would breach the last of our defenses, and when they did, we would be ready to ensure they didn't take the ship without paying the price. The survivors were long gone, the escape pods scattered across the stars. The sound of heavy boots echoed from the hallway, a grim reminder of what was coming. The Gorvith were close. It was only a matter of time before they reached us, before they flooded the command center and finished what they had started. "We fight to the end," I said, my voice raspy from the smoke and dust that filled the air. I looked around the room, at the men and women who had fought beside me. There was no fear in their eyes. They were tired, but their resolve was unshakable. They had seen too much of this war, too much of what the universe had become, to give up now. The first Gorvith soldier appeared at the entrance, a monstrous figure stepping into the dimly lit room. His armor gleamed under the flickering lights, and his eyes, those cruel, soulless eyes, met mine with cold indifference. He raised his weapon, and I fired first, sending a blast of energy toward him. It hit him square in the chest, but he barely reacted. His thick armor absorbed the blow, and he continued forward, unfazed. "We're not done yet," I shouted, rallying the crew around me. The last few of us fired relentlessly, each shot a desperate plea for survival, for the chance to at least make them bleed. But the Gorvith kept coming, and with every shot we fired, we felt our strength waning. I glanced at the timer on my wrist. Just moments left. The detonators were counting down, each second a cruel reminder that we had failed in the most fundamental way. We couldn't save everyone. The escape pods were all gone, and the last hope for humanity lay in the hands of those who fought to the very end. The explosion came without warning. A shockwave rippled through the Endeavor, and for a brief moment, I thought we had succeeded in our last-ditch effort. But then, there was nothing but darkness. The ship groaned as it began to break apart, the destruction tearing through every deck and compartment, consuming everything in its path. I couldn't tell if I was dead or alive. The world seemed to spin around me, the walls of the command center collapsing, the ship itself falling apart in slow motion. My ears rang, and for a moment I thought I could hear the faintest whisper, like a voice in the wind. But it was just the echo of our final moments. The last breath of a dead galaxy. The last of humanity was gone, but not without leaving a mark. The message we had fought so hard to carry had been passed on, whether the Gorvith realized it or not. We had fought to the last for the weak, and that, at least, was something they could never take from us. In the end, we had fulfilled our duty. The universe was broken, but humanity had fought with all its heart to preserve something worth saving, something worth protecting. Even as the stars dimmed, even as the galaxy died, we had given everything to make sure the last message of the dead galaxy would be one of hope, of strength, and of defiance, and in that we had succeeded.